In the fall of 1897, in a small working-class village in rural Massachusetts, something happened that parish records have never been able to fully explain. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. A man disappeared for 17 days. When he returned, he brought with him a silence that no one could break. This is the story of Thomas Whitmore, and of those who knew him before and after that October. The archives of the First Congregational Church of Ashford Mills describe Thomas as a 32-year-old man, a worker at the Hutchins & Sons sawmill, married to Eleanor Whitmore, father of 2 young daughters. An ordinary man, quiet, punctual, with calloused hands and a calm gaze. The village at the turn of the century was a cluster of dark wooden houses surrounding the sawmill and the church. Smoke rose from the chimneys at dusk. The smell of sawdust mixed with that of baked bread wafted from the open windows. The streets were unpaved, mud stuck to the boots. The church bell marked the hours, and everyone heard it. Thomas lived in a modest house on Elm Road, the second one after the stone bridge over the creek. It was a simple building. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a small porch where Eleanor used to sit with the girls on Sunday afternoons. The windows had faded linen curtains. The front door creaked. Eleanor Whitmore, according to baptismal records, was 28 years old. She was the daughter of a deceased blacksmith. She could read. She taught her daughters with a primer inherited from her mother. She had slender but strong hands. She did sewing for others. She sold preserves at the Saturday market. She was known for her upright posture and for never missing Mass. Her daughters, Mary, 7, and Ruth, 4, were quiet children. Mary helped her mother. Ruth always carried a faceless rag doll made by her grandmother. Thomas worked from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening. He came home covered in sawdust. He washed himself at the pump in the yard, even in the cold. He ate dinner in silence. Then he sat by the fire while Eleanor sewed and the girls played on the floor. He hardly spoke, but his presence filled the house. Neighbors described him as reserved but decent. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't miss work. He paid his bills on time. He greeted people with a nod, nothing more. But there is something in the archives that caught the attention of those who, decades later, tried to reconstruct what happened. A small detail, almost invisible. A note in the margin of the sawmill's attendance book made by Foreman Augustus Cole, dated October 3, 1897, 2 weeks before the disappearance. T. Whitmore arrived on time but stood motionless in front of the saw for almost 10 minutes. He did not respond when called. Then he returned to normal. No explanation. Eleanor never mentioned this to anyone, but in the diary she kept, found years later among her daughter Mary's belongings, there is an entry from the same week. Thomas sat at the table and stared at his hands for a long time. I asked if he was okay. He said yes, but he didn't touch his food. Small signs, almost nothing. And then, in the early hours of October 18, 1897, Thomas Whitmore left home, and he didn't come back. For 17 days no one knew where he was. When he reappeared, something in him had changed, something that the records could never name, but that everyone felt. To understand what happened that October, we must go back to the previous months, to the ordinary days, to the routines that made up the life of Thomas Whitmore and his family. The spring of 1897 had been rainy. The roads turned to mud. The sawmill worked less. Payments were delayed. Thomas received his salary 10 days late in April. Eleanor noted in her diary that they had to ask for credit at Mr. Abrams's store. She wrote, "I don't like being in debt, but the girls need to eat." Thomas didn't complain. He continued to leave every day before dawn. He came back with his hands stained with resin. The smell of pine permeated his clothes. Eleanor washed his shirts on Sundays, hanging them on the clothesline behind the house. The wind carried the sound of the church bell. In June, there was an accident at the sawmill. A worker named Caleb Hurst lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The saw blade caught his glove. He screamed. Augustus Cole ordered the machines to be stopped. Thomas was 3 meters away. He saw everything. That night, according to Eleanor, he sat on the porch until late. She came out with a shawl and asked if he wanted to come inside. Thomas said yes, but he stayed for another half hour, looking into the darkness. The next day he returned to work as usual. July brought heat. The girls played barefoot in the yard. Eleanor picked herbs in the small garden bed near the fence. Thomas built a wooden bench under the apple tree. It was a simple but solid piece of work. He did it on a Saturday afternoon while his daughters watched in silence. Mary asked if she could help. He handed her some nails. Ruth sat beside them, hugging her doll. Augustus Cole mentioned in a letter to a cousin in Boston that Thomas was the best sawyer in Hutchins. He said he had a steady hand and never wasted wood. He works as if he were praying, Cole wrote. But August brought something different. Eleanor wrote in her diary without a specific date. Thomas woke up in the middle of the night. He was sitting on the bed looking out the window. I asked him what was wrong. He said he heard something. I stayed quiet, listening. I heard nothing, only the crickets. 2 weeks later, another entry. I found Thomas standing on the bridge over the creek on his way to church. He was looking at the water. I called him 3 times before he heard me. He smiled and said he was thinking. I didn't ask what. Mrs. Abigail Thorne, a neighbor who lived next door, told her granddaughter years later that she saw Thomas standing in the yard before dawn one September morning. He had his back to the house, looking at the line of trees beyond the property, motionless, for so long that she thought it strange. When the sun rose, he finally turned and went inside. No one asked any questions. In Ashford Mills, people didn't pry. Each family took care of its own sorrows. Silence was a form of respect. In early October, Thomas began going out for walks after dinner. Eleanor thought he needed the air. The girls were already asleep. He would put on his coat, light his lantern, and go out. He would return half an hour later, sometimes less. Eleanor never asked where he was going. But Mary, the eldest daughter, said decades later in an interview with a local historian that she woke up one night and saw her father through the window. He was standing near the fence, holding the lantern, staring into the darkness. Motionless, she went back to sleep. On October 15th, 3 days before he disappeared, Thomas came home, and Eleanor noticed something. She wrote, "His boots were muddy, but it hadn't rained that day, and the path to the sawmill is paved with stone." She didn't ask. On the 16th, Thomas ate dinner as usual. He helped Mary with her writing lesson. He sat by the fire. Eleanor was sewing. Ruth was sleeping in her mother's lap. Everything was quiet. Then Thomas said, without looking at Eleanor, "If I don't come back one night, don't worry." Eleanor stopped sewing. She looked at him. Thomas kept staring at the fire. "Why wouldn't you come back?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said slowly, "Sometimes a man needs to go somewhere." Eleanor waited, but he said nothing more. She wrote in her diary that night, "I didn't understand what he meant, but there was something in his voice that made me feel cold." On the 17th, Thomas worked all day. Augustus Cole recorded nothing unusual. He came home on time. He had dinner. He kissed his daughters on the forehead. Eleanor served tea. They sat until 9 o'clock that night. Then Thomas went up to the bedroom. Eleanor followed him half an hour later. He was already lying on his back, staring at the ceiling. She lay down beside him. The house was silent. Around 3 in the morning, Eleanor woke up. Thomas was not in bed. She got up, went downstairs. The front door was ajar. The lantern was not on its hook. She went out onto the porch. The night was cold. No moon. The wind made the trees sway. Thomas was not in the yard. Eleanor went back inside. She waited. She thought he had gone out to the outhouse or to fetch firewood, but he did not return. At 6 in the morning, when the sun began to rise, Eleanor went to the Thorne house. It was the first time she said aloud, "Thomas left during the night, and he has not yet returned." The search began at noon on October 18th. Augustus Cole gathered 6 men from the sawmill. Reverend Elias Corbett mobilized 4 others from the congregation. They formed 2 groups. One followed the main road north, where the farms were located. The other went down the creek toward the forest that surrounded the village on the west side. Eleanor stayed home with the girls. Mrs. Thorne brought bread. Eleanor didn't eat. She sat in the chair by the window with Ruth on her lap and stared out at the road. Mary sat on the floor, holding her sister's doll. No one spoke. The men returned at dusk. They had found nothing, no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no clothing. Thomas's lantern was not found either. Augustus Cole asked Eleanor if Thomas had said anything, if he had mentioned any place, if he seemed upset. Eleanor repeated what he had said 2 days earlier. Sometimes a man needs to go somewhere. Cole frowned. He asked if Thomas had any debts, problems, enemies. Eleanor said no. Reverend Corbett suggested that perhaps Thomas had gone to the neighboring town. Maybe there was some work, some emergency. Maybe he would be back soon. Eleanor said nothing. She just nodded. But in her diary that night she wrote, "They don't know, but I know. Thomas didn't go anywhere of his own free will. Something called him." She didn't explain what she meant by that. In the days that followed, the whole village talked about the disappearance. Some women said that Thomas had abandoned his family, that he had another woman somewhere, that quiet men always keep secrets. Others thought he had gotten lost in the woods, that maybe he had fallen somewhere, that he was injured. The men at the sawmill said little, but Augustus Cole sent a telegram to the county sheriff. The reply came 3 days later. No body found. No report of a man matching the description. Eleanor continued to wait. Mary and Ruth stopped playing. They sat quietly near their mother. Ruth wouldn't let go of her doll. Mary asked once, "Is Daddy coming back?" Eleanor replied, "Yes," but her voice was empty. On the 7th day, a farmer named Josiah Brenner showed up at the Whitmore house. He came from a farm 15 kilometers to the north. He said he had heard about the disappearance, and that he had something to say. He said that on the night of October 17th, around 4 in the morning, he was awake because one of his cows was calving. He left the barn and saw in the distance a light moving along the road. A lantern. Someone walking. He didn't think much of it at the time. But now, knowing about the disappearance, he thought he should mention it. Augustus Cole asked if he had seen who it was. Josiah said no. It was too far away. But the light was heading toward the forest. And then it disappeared among the trees. That changed everything. The next day, the men returned to the forest. This time they went deeper. They followed the hunting trails. They crossed the stream at 3 different points. They called Thomas's name. The sound echoed among the tree trunks. Nothing. The forest was dense. The ground was covered with damp leaves. There were ravines, loose rocks, roots that intertwined like fingers. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. Eleanor stopped writing in her diary. The girls stopped asking questions. The village stopped talking. Silence settled over the Whitmore house like a fog. Augustus Cole offered financial assistance. Eleanor accepted. Reverend Corbett visited twice. She received him politely, but she didn't want prayer. In the 2nd week, Eleanor began to go out again. She resumed sewing. She resumed selling preserves. The neighbors said she looked older. Her face hardened, her eyes sunken. Mary returned to classes at the church. Ruth stayed home clutching her doll. Life went on, as it always does. And then, on the afternoon of November 4th, 17 days after he disappeared, Thomas Whitmore returned. Mary was the first to see him. She was coming back from church when she stopped in the middle of the road. She stared at the figure walking slowly down Elm Road. It was a man, dressed in the same clothes he had been wearing when he left. His shirt was dirty. His pants were torn. His boots were covered in mud. He walked slowly. His head was slightly bowed. His hands hung at his sides. Mary ran home shouting, "Mom! Mom! It's Dad!" Eleanor ran out. Ruth was behind her. Thomas was standing in front of the gate. Eleanor stopped 3 meters away from him. They looked at each other. For a long moment no one said anything. Then Eleanor took a step forward, and another, and another. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face, his hands, his eyes. Thomas said nothing. Eleanor touched his face, slowly, as if testing whether he was real. "Where have you been?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on her, but there was something in them, something Eleanor couldn't identify. After a long silence, he said, his voice hoarse, "I don't know." Eleanor felt something freeze inside her, but she hugged him and took him inside. The girls stood on the porch, watching. Ruth clutched her doll to her chest. Mary didn't move, because something in them, something that children sense before adults, realized. The man who entered the house was Thomas Whitmore, but he wasn't the same man who had left. In the first few hours after his return, no one asked any questions. Eleanor prepared hot water. Thomas washed himself in the kitchen, in silence. She brought him clean clothes. He dressed slowly, as if he were relearning the movements. He sat down at the table. Eleanor served soup. He ate, without rushing, without speaking. The girls watched from the bedroom door. Mary held Ruth's hand. Neither of them approached. Eleanor asked again in a low voice, "Where have you been?" Thomas looked at his plate, then at her, and said, "I don't remember." It wasn't a lie. There was something in his voice, something empty, that made Eleanor believe him. She didn't insist. That night, Thomas went up to the bedroom. He lay down. Eleanor sat in the kitchen for an hour. When she finally went upstairs, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling. She lay down beside him. Neither of them slept. News of his return spread through the village before dawn. Augustus Cole appeared the next morning. He knocked on the door. Eleanor answered. Cole asked to speak to Thomas. Eleanor called him. Thomas came downstairs. They sat in the living room. Cole asked questions. "Where have you been?" "I don't know." "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did someone take you?" Thomas hesitated. Then he said, "I don't remember." Cole looked at Eleanor. She remained silent. Cole sighed. He said that the important thing was that Thomas was back, that he should rest, that he could return to work when he felt ready. Thomas just nodded. But something in Cole's gaze, recorded years later in a letter to his brother, said he didn't completely believe it. "The man who came back is not the same man who left," Cole wrote. "I can't explain it, but everyone felt it." Reverend Corbett visited on the third day. He brought a Bible. He offered prayer. Thomas accepted politely, but when the Reverend placed his hand on Thomas's head to bless him, something happened. Thomas closed his eyes tightly. His body stiffened. The Reverend stopped. He looked at Thomas. Thomas opened his eyes. He apologized. He said he was tired. The Reverend left shortly after. He commented to his wife that night that he had sensed something wrong in the Whitmore house, and not something evil, but something out of place, as if the air were heavier. Thomas returned to work the second week. He arrived on time. He put on his apron. He stood at the saw. Augustus Cole watched from a distance. Thomas worked normally. His hand was steady. His cuts were precise, no mistakes. But the other men noticed something. Thomas didn't speak. Before he was quiet, but he responded when someone spoke to him. Now he simply didn't respond. He would look at the person, nod slightly, and go back to work. And there was something else. He didn't blink as much as before. One of the workers, named Samuel Pratt, mentioned this in a conversation at the bar. He said he had been watching Thomas for almost 10 minutes, and that he had only blinked twice. "It's as if he's looking through things," said Pratt. Augustus Cole dismissed the rumors, but he began to observe Thomas himself, and he saw it. Thomas worked, but there was a distance in his eyes, as if he were far away, even though he was right there. At home, the changes were more subtle, but Eleanor felt them all. Thomas ate dinner, but he chewed slowly, very slowly, as if he were paying attention to every movement of his jaw. He would sit by the fire, but he wouldn't look at the flames. He would look beyond them. He would go up to his room, but Eleanor would wake up in the middle of the night and find him sitting on the edge of the bed, motionless, sometimes for hours. She asked him once, "Are you okay?" He looked at her and said, "Yes," but his voice was flat, emotionless. Eleanor wrote in her diary for the first time since their return, "He's here, but he's not. I can't explain it any better than that." The girls were afraid. Mary didn't say anything, but she avoided being alone with her father. When he entered a room, she found an excuse to leave. Ruth simply didn't go near him. She stayed close to her mother, always, holding her doll. watching Thomas from afar. One night, Eleanor found Ruth crying in her room. She asked her what was wrong. Ruth, between sobs, said, "That's not Daddy." Eleanor's heart sank. She pulled her daughter close. She said yes, that it was him, that her father was just tired, that everything would be fine soon. But Ruth shook her head. "No, Mom, that's not him." Eleanor didn't know how to respond. The truth, or the closest thing to it that could be pieced together, came from an unexpected place. In early December, a wanderer passed through Ashford Mills. He asked for shelter at the church. Reverend Corbett took him in. During their conversation, the wanderer mentioned that he had come from the mountains to the north, that he had spent weeks walking through the forests, and that, in mid-October, he had found something strange. He said he was camping near a ravine, about 30 kilometers north of the village, when he heard a sound, a low moan, almost a cry. He grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate. He found a man, lying on the ground, dirty, injured, unconscious. The wanderer helped him. He gave him water. He tried to wake him up, but the man seemed to be in shock. He opened his eyes, but he couldn't focus. He mumbled meaningless words. The wanderer stayed with him for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the man woke up. He seemed to recognize him. He got up and started walking. The wanderer asked if he needed help. The man said no, that he knew the way home, and he left. Reverend Corbett asked what the man was like. The wanderer described Thomas Whitmore. Corbett felt a chill down his spine. He asked, "And what did he say when he woke up?" The wanderer hesitated. Then he replied, he said, I saw where they are going." Corbett asked what that meant. The wanderer said he didn't know, that the man didn't explain, that he simply got up and left. Reverend Corbett visited Eleanor the next day. He told her the story. He asked if Thomas had mentioned anything about what he saw, about where he had been. Eleanor said no, that Thomas didn't remember anything. Corbett was silent. Then he said slowly, "Eleanor, are you afraid of him?" Eleanor looked at the Reverend, and for the first time since his return, she admitted, yes. Thomas Whitmore lived another 23 years after his return. He continued to work at the sawmill. He continued to live in the same house. He continued to be Eleanor's husband and Mary and Ruth's father. But something fundamental had changed, and it never came back. The records of what happened in the following years are fragmented, but they are enough to reconstruct the essentials. Eleanor remained by his side, not out of love, not in the same way anymore, but out of a sense of duty that women of that era knew well. She took care of the house. She raised her daughters. She grew old alongside a man she no longer fully recognized. In her diary, she wrote only 3 more times about Thomas. The first entry, in March 1898, he smiled today. It was the first time in months. But it wasn't a real smile. It was as if he were imitating something he had seen other people do. The second, in June 1901, the girls are growing up. Thomas watches them, but it's as if he were studying them, not loving them. The third and last, with no exact date, probably around 1905. I got used to it. I don't know if that's good or sad, but I got used to the silence, to the distance. Sometimes I think I lost my husband that October night, and what came back was just his form. Mary grew up and got married at 19. She moved to Connecticut. She rarely came back to visit. When she did visit, she stayed for a short time. In an interview decades later, she said, "I loved my father, but I couldn't be around him. There was something about him that made me feel watched, even when he wasn't looking at me." Ruth never married. She lived with Eleanor until her mother's death in 1918. Then she moved to Boston, where she worked as a seamstress. She never talked about her father. When asked, she changed the subject. The faceless rag doll she carried during her childhood was found among her belongings after her death in 1962, preserved, intact. Thomas died in January 1920 at the age of 55. Pneumonia. He was mourned at the church. Few people attended. Augustus Cole was there, already elderly. He stood in front of the coffin for a long time. Then he said to the Reverend who succeeded Corbett, "I knew this man for 20 years, and I never knew who he was." Eleanor died 2 years later. She was buried next to Thomas in the small cemetery behind the church. Their gravestones still exist. Simple. No epitaphs. In 1954, a local historian named Arthur Donnelly began researching old cases of disappearances in the county. He found references to the Whitmore case in the church archives. He interviewed Mary, who was then 64 years old. She told him what she remembered. She showed him her mother's diary. Donnelly wrote a short article for the regional newspaper. The title was, "The Man Who Came Back Different, a Mystery from 1897. The article mentioned the possibility that Thomas had suffered some kind of psychological trauma. Perhaps he had gotten lost in the woods, gone hungry, cold, lonely, and that would have altered his personality, his perception, his ability to connect emotionally. It was a rational explanation, plausible, reassuring. But Donnelly ended the article with a sentence that even he couldn't explain why he included. Or maybe Thomas Whitmore saw something in that forest, something no man should ever see, and it changed him in a way we can never understand. Today, more than 100 years later, the house on Elm Road no longer exists. It was demolished in 1972. In its place is a parking lot. The Hutchins & Sons sawmill closed in 1938. The building was converted into a warehouse, then abandoned. Now it lies in ruins. The First Congregational Church of Ashford Mills still stands, renovated, modernized, but the cemetery remains, and the gravestones of Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore can still be seen, covered in moss, almost forgotten. No one visits, no one remembers, but there is something that the archives cannot record, something that only those who lived at that time could feel. The feeling Eleanor had every night as she lay down beside Thomas. The certainty Mary carried throughout her life without ever being able to prove it. The silent fear Ruth felt, which prevented her from having a family of her own. The perception Augustus Cole had, but never fully verbalized. Something was wrong. Not in an obvious way, not in a violent way, but in a profound way. Permanent, irreversible. Thomas Whitmore left home in the early hours of October 18, 1897, and the man who returned 17 days later wore his face, his clothes, his name. But it wasn't him, not completely. There are things that time cannot explain. There are disappearances that have no answer. There are silences that last longer than voices. And there are people who return, but not in the same way. Thomas Whitmore was one of those people, and Eleanor knew. Until the end, she knew, but she never said it out loud, because some truths are too heavy to speak, and some losses are too permanent to name. Somewhere, in a dusty file, Eleanor Whitmore's diary still holds the last entry she wrote. A single sentence, no date, written in shaky handwriting. He came back, but he didn't come back.